Well, good morning, and good to see so many people here this morning. And thank you, Ingrid, for the introduction and for setting out what we're talking. I'm not quite sure there's much left to say, Ingrid, after that fantastic introduction. And it's great to be here once again when both Dublin and Donegal are still in the championship. So the summer is just beginning in terms of the football. I'd like to thank Joe. Oh, there's Joe there. Joe's behind me, getting a bit. Oh, thank you very much. That's great. For volunteering me once again to talk on this topic. Last year I was here and we talked in general terms about the plans the government was about to announce. So I'm very much delighted to be here to talk about the progress. I think there's been very significant progress, enormous progress made in terms of reforming the public sector. And by the time I'm finished in 11, 12 minutes' time, we're all going to be convinced about the scale of the change, the enormity of the scale. And this debate is going to be over before Patricia and Paul even get started. But I think it's very important talking about reform that not talk about general terms. When people say we need to reform and we need to do this and that, and I say, well, Blaine, give it to me the detail. Give me the specific details of exactly what you want to see. So I'm going to talk today about some of the specifics. Some of this, I must apologise in advance, can get very technocratic and boring and dull when you're talking about shared services and procurement reform. It's not the sexiest set of topics, so I'll brush over those quickly. But some of these technocratic changes are absolutely fundamentally important in terms of taking out cost and improving the service. So last November, Brendan Howell, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, as a civil servant, you have to mention your minister several times in a speech. That's the first one over with. There'll be a few more. Give credit where credit is due. Minister Howell announced in November of last year a very significant agenda with hundreds of different actions and specific actions. And we decided this time round to avoid the glossy presentation, to avoid the razzmatazz, and to set out specific actions, changes with timelines and individuals beside those timelines who are responsible for implementation. So we moved to a completely different way of looking at how we actually drive change and how we drive this type of reform plan. So I'm going to talk about sort of three broad areas in terms of what we're doing. Firstly, in terms of how we manage people, how we manage the resource. Public service is very labour intensive. Of the 55 billion of voted spending now, for this year, about a third of that spending, little under a third, is pay and pension. So when we talk about the public sector, we're talking about people, teachers, nurses, doctors, frontline, Gardaí, defence and so on. And most of the public servants, as you know, are not bureaucrats like me or managers or administrators. They're people providing frontline service. I'll talk a little bit about that, talk a little bit about the way we're organised and how we try to manage spending and how we try to manage money and the reform agenda in that area. Firstly, in terms of managing people, we are experiencing a very significant reduction in the overall pay bill. Between 2009 and 2015, the pay bill will have reduced by 20%, a very significant reduction in the cost of the public service to the taxpayer. And this will come about in a number of different ways: the pay cuts, the pension levy that we've seen, and also a very significant reduction in the number of public servants. Ingrid mentioned we brought the numbers down from 320,000 to 292,000, and there will be a further 10,000 reduction between now and 2015. This is an enormous reduction, and we haven't done this by laying off teachers, or nurses, or frontline employees. We've done it by squeezing back office and squeezing the non-core activities. And this is at a time when the demand for public services has increased. So when we've been reducing numbers, the demand for services that we provide across a whole range of different areas has also increased. So in effect, we've seen a very significant improvement in productivity, a very significant increase in productivity. So we've managed to take large numbers of people out of the system and sustain the volume of public services. And we've done this a number of days. Firstly, through redeployment. For most of the history of the state, it was impossible to move civil servants around between departments, or move people to local authorities, or to move hospital employees from one part of the health system, which, as you all know, is an enormous system, to another part. We now have very significant redeployment, thanks to Croke Park and thanks to the ongoing cooperation with the trade unions. For example, in 2011-2012, 1,000 teachers were moved between schools. Over the last 2 years, 4,500 employees in the health sector have moved between jobs. So this has enabled us to deal with a very significant reduction in numbers and also a very significant increase in demand while sustaining the overall level of service. We have, in addition, made changes to public service pensions that Ingrid mentioned. We now have a new public service scheme which was passed through all stages of the Oireachtas last week. This is the most comprehensive reform of pensions we've ever had, public sector pensions. And I was intrigued last night to hear the debate about the role of committees. I think Dan O'Brien was suggesting that committees don't play much of a role In terms of this piece of legislation, there was enormous engagement over months and months with members of the Oireachtas. A bill was prepared and a large number of amendments were debated and accepted in a lot of cases. And this is what the Oireachtas does, and there was incredible engagement. And I should say, if Dan is here, this engagement was not reported at all in the Irish Times or any of the other newspapers, for that matter. So I think if people are going to criticise the role of committees and they're not doing their job and scrutinise legislation, they should at least turn up and look at what they're doing and maybe the odd time report on what members of the Oireachtas are actually doing. So we have engaged in this reform of public service pensions, and as I mentioned, the bill has been passed. A number of things which are ongoing, which people are aware of: sick leave, changes in sick leave arrangements. We do know within the public sector we have a challenge in terms of managing sick leave, and we have now reformed entitlements, but reformed them in a way which keeps people with us and which keeps our reputation as a good employer, because we want to be a good employer as the public sector, while at the same time ensuring that people face the correct incentives to ensure that sick leave is managed in a sensible way to ensure that people turn up when they ought to. Roster reforms. Across a large number of parts of the system we have reformed roster arrangements. And again, it's interesting that some of these things receive very little publicity or don't receive much attention at all in public discourse. We had the same arrangements for the Gardaí in terms of how they manage their time for about 50 years. And we now have reformed these rosters to ensure that more Gardaí are available when they're needed on Friday, Saturday night and peak times. We have also, in the schools, universities, there are more hours worked, and there are significant changes across each part of the health sector in terms of rosters and how work is managed. Again, very significant changes. In terms of this agenda and what we're doing, progress has been made and much more needs to be done, as they say, as the cliche goes. But I think it is fair to say that we do have issues around management and leadership, that we don't have uniformly across the system the level of leadership or the capacity or the change management capacity that's required. And this is something that we need to address, and it's a major challenge for the government and a major challenge for our department. And we've made a number of steps, taken a number of steps, and I propose to take some more. Firstly, we've established at senior level within the system the Senior Public Service, where we now have an integrated approach to managing senior resources. And the Government last week have approved a set of proposals to improve mobility between the public and private sector. So from the autumn, for the first time, it will be possible for civil servants to leave the civil service and work in the private sector for a period of 3 years and come back into the system after that. And this is an attempt by us to widen the experience of senior managers in the system and to access experience and skills and capacities that exist outside. The Government have also agreed to introduce a formal exchange scheme between the public and private sector, so that we enter into formal secondment arrangements with companies in the private sector, so that our people can go out and that we take in expertise from the private sector. So this is a recognition of the need for us to enhance our leadership capacity and to address some of the deficits that do exist within the system. How we are organised and how we reform, in terms of how we organise, is another key aspect of the reform agenda. This is the extremely technocratic part of the presentation. But there are a number of key things that we're embarking on. One of them is shared services. Across the system, we have basic services like HR, payroll, financial management, pensions that are provided by a large number of organisations diffused across the system. So we are now consolidating all these services within the civil service and also within the main sectors to reduce the numbers of people that we have employed providing these basic back office services, and also to improve the level of service that we provide. This is a significant technocratic exercise involving a large level of investment up front and a large reform of the structures and how we go about. So in the future, in concrete terms, government departments won't have responsibility anymore for transactional HR, for payroll, for pensions, for a whole variety of issues, ICT, procurement. Departments will, in one sense, hollowed out and will be focused on their core tasks of policy development, foresight, planning, supporting the government, developing legislation, and so on. And this will, over time, be a very fundamental change in how departments look and how they feel. ICT, we are doing a whole variety of things in terms of ICT, moving more services online. We're developing a public service card, where by the end of the year we'll have a few 100,000 of these cards in the system. We're doing more data sharing across different parts of the system, and we hope to move to a situation where an individual who provides a piece of information to one part of the system, that the default position of that information will be available then across all elements of the system, of course having regard to data protection considerations and so on. External service delivery. I think we have to accept and recognise that in the context of a smaller public service with fewer people and reduced expenditure, that we need to embrace external service delivery, and we need to look at aspects of what we do, non-core activities, and consider the role the private sector can play in providing these services. So we're now engaged in an exercise of looking at activities that could be available for external service delivery, or that we engage in partnership with the private sector. And of course, under Croke Park, we need to set out clearly that the cost-benefit works and that there's a very strong case for moving to a different service delivery model. How we manage spending and how we manage the resources of the state is another key part of the reform agenda. We have had a very modern budget system based on the 1866 Exchequer and Appropriations Bill, passed some years ago, so we believe that time is right for change in this. And we've now moved from an annual approach to estimates to a multi-annual approach, where in the past the whole focus was on 1 year, and now, last year, the government set out 3-year envelopes for departments. So departments have a reasonable idea of what their allocations are over a 3-year period, so they can plan over that time horizon and look at the steps they need to take and the policy decisions that need to be taken in order to stay within that envelope. As part of that, there is planned to have much more engagement by Oireachtas committees in the whole budget process. A criticism in the past was that the Department of Finance, the Minister of Finance, would present the budget to the Oireachtas and there would be some debate and that would be passed. Now we have broad envelopes set out for 2013, for 2014, and Oireachtas committees have been asked to engage with ministers and departments on the options that need to be taken in order to stay within those envelopes. So this is an attempt to ensure the Oireachtas and members of the Oireachtas have much more of a role in terms of how resources are allocated, what are the priorities for resource allocation. We also know that we can't just set out what we're going to spend in the overall cash allocation and not set out what we're hoping to achieve for it. And we now have prepared a new estimates volume. I know people in this room will all have, along with the Mahon Tribunal and Bunnock na Herne, been reading the estimates volume and consulting it, Joe, in great detail. But the estimates volume now not just has the allocations for departments, but actually has set out what we're hoping to achieve, what the outcomes and what the outputs that departments are hoping to achieve with the allocation they're being given. Again, this is to move to a more performance-based approach rather than focus on the inputs exclusively. There are a number of other initiatives that we've taken in terms of publishing a new value for money code, setting out how we evaluate spending proposals and how we evaluate options the government is considering. We are moving to more of an online performance-based system where we set out in detail across different elements of the public sector exactly how we're doing against various matrix, and this is something which has been led by Minister Brian Hayes. You have to mention Minister Hayes as well. I almost forgot to mention Minister Hayes, so get him in too. Minister Hayes is part of this drive, and the Minister is responsible for this part of the agenda to set out in terms that people can understand and clearly identify what progress has been made against various matrix. Our department, in addition to managing budgets, reforming, engage with the Department of Finance on the Troika, asset sales, a whole variety of other issues. We're also involved in the government political reform agenda. Minister Howland is the Minister responsible for driving this whole political and government reform. And we have set out a very significant number of proposals and pieces of draft legislation already. Some of this was touched upon last night in the discussion on the Convention. And the Convention is a very important innovation, a very important development, which I'm sure will be a success. But of course there are a large number of reforms that can take place without changing the Constitution, which can be delivered within the current constitutional construct. Minister Howland has published very detailed proposals on lobbying and regulation of lobbying, which should introduce a much more transparent approach to how the political system and the civil service are influenced by people out there. Very detailed plans to reform freedom of information, to extend it to a large number of bodies, and to bring it back to where it was in 2003 have been developed. Very significant legislation on whistleblowers has been developed. And again, Oireachtas committees have been spending, considerable amount of time debating and improving this legislation in recent months. There are proposals in relation to the Ombudsman, extending the remit of the Ombudsman to a whole variety of other bodies that are currently excluded. And in response to Mahon Tribunal, which Joe touched on earlier and I was subject of debate, we are now looking at the whole ethics framework and reforming the ethics framework, along with the rules about accountability and the roles of civil servants versus the political system. So there's a very significant political reform agenda and government reform agenda to complement the public service reform agenda in terms of reducing costs and providing better service delivery. Finally, I should say that I think it's true that in the past we announced plans and weren't very good at execution, and we had, I think Eddie Malloy calls it the deficit, implementation deficit disorder. I think that's true, and I think we've learned from this and have set up new structures, a cabinet committee chaired by the Taoiseach, which meets every quarter, and we have a clear timeline for implementation, a clear plan where we have to set out exactly what we're doing against each of those. And we plan to publish in end August, early September, a progress report setting out across all these items I've been talking about in general terms exactly where we are and what progress we've made. Croke Park is important, of course, in this endeavour, and we might in the Q&A discuss some of that. I'm conscious of time, and maybe just to conclude that I think the system that we have is complex and quite significant, 292,000 people. It's involved in the provision of a whole variety of different services. We're embarked in fundamental change and fundamental reform across a whole swathe of parts of the system to improve service, to have more integrated service, a leaner service, to have cost extraction. We have delivered a significant amount in a year. Our department was established a year ago, this month, last July. And within that period, I think we've delivered a lot, and there's an awful lot more to do. But the objective ultimately is to have a much more responsive, leaner system, which ultimately that people can be proud of. So thank you very much.